David Thompson, the 48-year-old CEO of Burger Haven, sat in his sleek corner office, staring at the latest reports that had come across his desk. The numbers weren't adding up. Employee turnover had surged, customer complaints had spiked, and despite the company's growth, there seemed to be a noticeable decline in the quality of service. David had spent years building Burger Haven from the ground up, expanding from a small local joint to a thriving chain with hundreds of locations across the country. It had always been his goal to create not just a business, but a family environment, a place where employees felt valued and customers were treated like gold. But lately, something wasn't right. His employees weren't happy, and neither were his customers. He had tried to rely on the standard reports that came from his regional managers, but the numbers seemed to tell a different story than what was happening on the ground. The turnover rates were higher than expected, and his stores were dealing with more and more customer complaints about poor service, slow orders, and unprofessional staff. Yet the reports painted a rosy picture. Managers were saying everything was fine, that they were handling things efficiently. But David's gut told him that something deeper was going on, something that wasn't reflected in the numbers. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he needed to see it for himself. He couldn't keep relying on second-hand information. If he wanted to understand the full scope of the issue, he had to go directly to the source, the employees themselves. David's decision was swift and clear. He would go undercover. As the CEO of a large company, it wasn't something he had ever envisioned himself doing, but he knew it was the only way to get an unfiltered view of the situation. He couldn't just sit back and rely on the same tired reports. He needed to hear the truth from the employees who were living it every day. With the help of a professional makeup artist, David transformed his appearance into that of an unrecognizable figure. Gone was his neatly groomed look. Instead, he sported a scruffy salt-and-pepper beard, wrinkled skin, and a set of thick-rimmed glasses. He wore a faded hoodie, old jeans, and sneakers, choosing an appearance that would make him blend seamlessly into the crowd. He created a new identity: John, an older man looking for a part-time job to stay busy in his retirement. The transformation was flawless. Nobody would recognize him. Not in a franchise like Burger Haven, where corporate executives were rarely seen by the employees. David selected a location that he had never visited before, a busy suburban store that seemed to be struggling the most. He applied for a position as a trainee cashier, a position that at first glance seemed like a low-level job, not worthy of his CEO status. But that was the point. He needed to understand the experience of his employees, and the best way to do that was to start at the bottom, exactly where most of them started. The manager at the store, clearly desperate to fill shifts, hired David immediately. There was no lengthy interview, no background check, just a quick rundown of his duties and a scanner stick to start his training. David didn't mind. It was all part of the disguise. As he stood behind the counter on his first day, the reality of the situation began to sink in. His hands shook slightly as he tried to remember the buttons on the register, but it wasn't the task that rattled him. It was the overwhelming chaos around him. The lunch rush hit hard, and customers lined up faster than the team could serve them. But it wasn't the madness of the lunch rush that froze David in place. It was the voice of a young cashier, Maya, no older than 20, who was complaining loudly to a coworker. She had no idea who David really was, and she had no filter as she vented her frustration. "I can't stand this place," she muttered angrily, slamming a tray onto the counter. "Management doesn't care about us at all. They just pile on more shifts and expect us to deal with it." David's heart dropped as he heard her words. It wasn't just the frustration in her voice, it was the raw, unfiltered truth. "And don't even get me started on how they treat us when we ask for time off," she added bitterly. David kept his head down, pretending to focus on his training, but his ears were locked onto every word she said. He couldn't ignore the truth that was staring him in the face. Another worker, Kyle, a lanky, nervous guy, whispered back, "Yeah, I tried talking to the manager about my hours. She just laughed, said if I didn't like it I could quit. Like, what kind of response is that?" The words cut through David like a knife. These weren't lazy workers making excuses. These were employees who were clearly overworked, undervalued, and feeling completely ignored by management. Maya's comment about management treating them like bodies struck a chord with him. The employees weren't just upset about minor inconveniences. They were frustrated and demoralized by a system that treated them as expendable. David had always prided himself on treating his employees like family, but the way these workers were being treated painted a completely different picture. They were being pushed beyond their limits, given long hours, and treated like their well-being didn't matter. The worst part was that it wasn't just Maya and Kyle who felt this way. Throughout the day, David overheard similar complaints from other workers. A cook in the back vented about broken equipment that never got fixed, and a shift supervisor muttered about being asked to work through her break. This wasn't just a one-off location. It was a systemic problem. Sitting in the cramped employee room during his break, David couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside him. He'd spent so many years building this company, working tirelessly to create something special, but now he was hearing firsthand about the deep cracks that had formed beneath the surface. His employees weren't complaining about minor inconveniences. They were speaking out about systemic problems that had been allowed to fester for far too long. David felt a pang of guilt. How had he let it get this bad? How had he become so disconnected from the day-to-day operations of his own company that he didn't even see this coming? His mind raced with questions, but there were no easy answers. All he knew was that he had to dig deeper and find out just how widespread these issues were. And he knew that, for the sake of his company and his employees, he couldn't ignore what he had learned so far. The conversation with Maya and Kyle had shaken him to his core, but it also made him realize that these issues weren't isolated. It wasn't just one bad manager or one disgruntled worker. The entire culture of the store needed to be re-examined. David had always believed that the strength of Burger Haven was built on its people, but it was clear now that something had gone terribly wrong. The passion, the loyalty, the sense of family he had once fostered. It had all been replaced by frustration, fear, and burnout. He had to find out why, and he couldn't afford to wait any longer. The next steps were clear. He had to confront the management, dig deeper into the store's operations, and uncover the truth, no matter how difficult it was to face. David Thompson's first day as John was nothing like what he had expected. Disguised in his unremarkable attire, a worn-out hoodie, scruffy beard, and thick-rimmed glasses, he stepped into the bustling environment of the Burger Haven store. The lunch rush hit immediately, the line stretching almost to the door as customers rushed in for their midday meal. The noise was overwhelming. The ringing of registers, the sizzle of burgers cooking on the grill, the rapid-fire orders being shouted across the kitchen. David, trying to get used to the motions of the register, felt a knot in his stomach. It had been years since he had worked behind the counter, and his hands shook as he tried to remember the buttons on the old-fashioned register. Every now and then he caught glimpses of the employees around him, hurriedly taking orders, flipping burgers, and trying to keep up with the ever-growing line of customers. Despite the chaos, what struck David most wasn't the fast-paced environment, it was the visible strain on the employees. Behind the counter, Emily, a young woman barely in her 20s, seemed especially frazzled. Her eyes were wide with frustration, her movements rushed and frantic as she tried to ring up the orders. As she slammed a tray down onto the counter, David heard her mutter something under her breath. He tried to focus on his own training, but his attention kept drifting back to her, drawn in by her discontent. Emily didn't seem to notice him watching, and her voice grew louder as she complained to her co-worker Kyle, who was just a few feet away. "I can't stand this place," she said, barely suppressing her anger. "Management doesn't care about us at all. They just pile on more shifts and expect us to deal with it." Her words were sharp, like a bitter release of pent-up frustration. David's heart sank as he realized this wasn't an isolated complaint. This was a voice of someone who had been pushed to the brink. Emily's words stuck with David, but it was what she said next that really hit him. "And don't even get me started on how they treat us when we ask for time off," she added, her voice dripping with disdain. At that moment, David felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. This wasn't just a disgruntled worker venting. It was a cry for help. He kept his head low, pretending to focus on the register, but his ears were tuned to every word she said. He glanced over at Kyle, a lanky and nervous young man who looked as though he was trying his best to keep up with the orders. "Yeah, I tried talking to the manager about my hours," Kyle whispered back, his voice barely audible. "She just laughed and said if I didn't like it, I could quit." Like, what kind of response is that? His tone was incredulous, as though he couldn't even believe how callous the response had been. Emily scoffed. "Typical," she said, rolling her eyes. "They don't care about us, Kyle. We're just bodies to them." David's stomach churned as he processed the weight of their words. He had heard stories of employees complaining in other companies, but this was different. This was his company. These were his employees, and they were speaking out about something far deeper than simple dissatisfaction. They were frustrated, overworked, and clearly felt unappreciated and undervalued. The management, specifically Denise, the store manager, had become a figure of resentment, someone who wasn't there to support the team, but to criticize them from a distance. David's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had just overheard. These weren't lazy workers complaining because they didn't want to work. They were hard-working individuals who had been pushed to their limits. They felt ignored and underappreciated. And the very company they worked for, the one they had helped build, had become a place of frustration and burnout. As the lunch rush continued, David couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. He was there to observe and understand what was going wrong in his company, but it was clear now that the problems ran deep. It wasn't just that the employees were overworked. They were emotionally drained, and it seemed like the leadership had lost touch with the needs of the workers. Denise, who should have been the one guiding and supporting the team, was nowhere to be seen. From what David had observed, she spent most of her time in the back office, leaving the team to manage the chaos without any real leadership. The employees, especially Emily and Kyle, had been left to carry the load, and from what David had heard, they were barely keeping their heads above water. During a short break, David took the opportunity to sit in the cramped employee room. It was small and sterile, the walls lined with old posters advertising the latest burger specials. He sat quietly, sipping his water, and watched the workers as they came and went. Emily sat across the table from him, her eyes glued to her phone as she scrolled absent-mindedly. Kyle was at the microwave, heating up a bowl of soup. His shoulders slumped in exhaustion. David, trying to keep things casual, decided to ask a few questions. "Hey, Kyle," he began, keeping his tone light. "How long have you worked here?" Kyle glanced up at him, his face tired. "About 6 months," he said. "Feels like 6 years, though." Emily snorted from across the table. "Yeah, that's about right," she said, shaking her head. "People don't last long here. Most quit after a few weeks." David was taken aback by the honesty in her response. "Why is that?" I pressed, genuinely curious. Emily gave him a look as if he had asked the most obvious question in the world. "Because it's a nightmare," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "The pace sucks, the hours suck, and management doesn't care." David felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Here he was, the CEO of the company, trying to see things from the perspective of an employee, but the truth was becoming clearer with every word. Emily's next comment hit him like a punch in the stomach. "I had a full-on panic attack last week because I was so stressed," she said. "And you know what my manager said? Can you finish your shift first, like—" "Are you kidding me?" Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, and David could see the depth of the exhaustion and frustration in her eyes. It wasn't just about the work. It was about the complete lack of care or empathy from the management. This wasn't what Burger Haven was supposed to be. This wasn't the company David had built, a place where employees were supposed to feel like family. But as he sat there, listening to Emily and Kyle, he realized just how far things had fallen. David's heart felt heavy with disappointment as he continued to sit in the break room, absorbing everything that was being said. The employees were breaking under the weight of poor management, and it was clear that something had to change. He had thought he could rely on his regional managers to keep things in check. But now, he saw that the root of the problem lay much closer to home. It wasn't just one store or one manager. It was a systemic issue that had affected the very foundation of Burger Haven. These were the workers who had built the company into what it was, and they deserved better than what they were getting. David knew that his next steps would be crucial. He couldn't just ignore what he had seen. It was time to make real changes, and he knew the first step would be confronting the leadership that had allowed this toxic environment to thrive. But before he could do that, he had to see just how bad things really were. And he wasn't going to stop until he had all the answers. As the days passed, David Thompson found himself increasingly drawn into the undercurrent of dissatisfaction that ran through the Burger Haven store. Despite his best efforts to stay focused on his training, he couldn't shake the conversations he overheard. The employees, who were working hard to keep up with the lunch rush and manage the never-ending stream of orders, were also quietly expressing their frustration with the management. It was evident that the deeper issue wasn't just about the chaotic work environment, it was the management itself. David had heard Emily venting about her struggles, but now, as he continued to observe the store's dynamics, he began to hear more from other employees. Jake, a young man working as a line cook, was particularly vocal during a brief lull between the lunch rush. David overheard Jake talking to another employee as they cleaned up their stations. "I swear Sarah doesn't care about any of us," Jake said, his voice low but filled with frustration. "Whenever I try to bring up anything, she just brushes it off like it's no big deal. If I ask for time off, I get a snide remark or she just ignores me. It's like I don't even exist to her." David's heart sank as he listened. This wasn't just a one-time complaint or an isolated issue, it was a pattern. Sarah, the store manager, had built a reputation for being cold, dismissive, and disconnected from her team. David had watched her from afar, and the picture that was emerging from the employees' words was concerning. They weren't asking for much, just fair treatment, recognition, and some basic respect. But it seemed like Sarah had little interest in supporting her staff, or even acknowledging their needs. The lack of empathy from management had already been made clear in Emily's earlier complaints, but hearing Jake's perspective only solidified David's understanding that the situation was much worse than he had imagined. The employees weren't just complaining, they were deeply frustrated and feeling ignored, undervalued, and unseen. Later that afternoon, as David observed the store from the back, he noticed more of the same. The pace of the work was relentless, but it wasn't just the physical strain that seemed to weigh on the employees. It was the emotional toll of working under leadership that had no regard for their well-being. Emily and Jake's complaints were echoed in the voices of others. During another break, David overheard Kyle speaking with another co-worker, his voice barely a whisper, as if he was afraid of being overheard. "I asked Sarah for a couple of days off next week because I've got school exams and she just laughed at me," Kyle confided. "She told me to figure it out. Like, she doesn't care if I have a life outside of this place. I'm just supposed to work my shifts and not ask questions. And don't get me started on how much overtime she piles on us. It's exhausting, man." Kyle's words stuck with David. It wasn't just a matter of being overworked. It was the complete lack of understanding or compassion from management. These employees weren't asking for the world. They were simply asking for the respect they deserved. But Sarah wasn't offering that. Instead, she dismissed their needs, disregarded their requests, and made them feel like their concerns didn't matter. Emily, too, revealed more during another conversation later in the day. As she wiped down tables in the dining area, she leaned over to Kyle, her voice tinged with frustration. "I asked for time off last month," she said, "and Sarah told me I'd have to work an extra shift if I wanted any time off at all. She literally said, 'You can work more or don't bother asking.'" Emily paused for a moment, her eyes clouding over with the weight of the memory. "And then when I went into her office to explain how burnt out I was, she looked at me like I was crazy. She didn't even apologize, didn't even acknowledge that I was struggling. I just felt like I was invisible." As Emily spoke, David felt the weight of her words like a punch to the gut. These were young workers, people trying to balance their jobs with personal responsibilities, and yet they were being treated like disposable parts of a machine. Emily wasn't the only one feeling this way. Kyle, Jake, and the others were all in the same boat. Their complaints were not just about minor inconveniences, they were about a toxic work culture fostered by a manager who didn't care. As David took all of this in, he realized just how deeply rooted the problem was. It wasn't just the occasional neglect, it was systemic. Sarah's management style wasn't an isolated issue at this store, it was a reflection of a broader problem within the company. These workers were tired, stressed, and emotionally drained, and their complaints were a symptom of a much larger issue: the lack of leadership and respect from the very people who were supposed to guide and support them. David began to see how these employees had been pushed to their limits. They were working long hours without the proper recognition or appreciation. They were given more shifts than they could handle, with little regard for their personal needs or well-being. And when they asked for help or raised concerns, they were met with dismissal or even ridicule. The more David heard, the more he felt his frustration building. How had this happened? How had the company he built, the company that was supposed to treat its employees like family, become a place of such exploitation and neglect? David's sense of urgency grew as he continued to hear the stories of burnout and mistreatment. This wasn't just about poor management. It was a failure of leadership at every level. It was clear that Sarah's inability to lead effectively had created a culture of resentment and frustration among the employees. They had lost trust in their manager, and it seemed like that loss of trust had spread throughout the store. David knew that something had to be done, but the question now was how deep the issue went. Was it just this one store, or was this the culture across all Burger Haven locations? He needed to know more. He needed to understand how widespread the damage was, and he couldn't afford to wait any longer. His decision to go undercover had been eye-opening, but it was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, but David knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The change he needed to make was bigger than just one store. It was a company-wide transformation that had to start now. David Thompson had spent most of his day blending into the chaotic environment of the Burger Haven store, quietly observing the dynamics between the employees and their manager, Sarah. The more he watched, the more he realized just how much Sarah's leadership style was contributing to the dysfunction he had been hearing about. Sarah, the store manager, rarely left her office. Instead, she sat behind her desk, buried in paperwork and micromanaging the schedules, with her eyes locked onto her computer screen. The employees who were supposed to be supported by her were left to fend for themselves, managing the store without much guidance or oversight from the one person who should have been leading them. David watched her from the back of the store as she barked orders over the headset and made snide remarks to the workers whenever something went wrong, but she was never there when they needed her the most. During the rush, when tempers flared, and when mistakes were made. Sarah's absence from the front lines of the store had created a clear disconnect between her and the employees. She didn't interact with the workers unless it was to criticize them, and the only time she seemed to engage was when she was micromanaging their every move. David saw Emily and Jake, two of the hardest workers in the store, struggling to keep up with the demands of the lunch rush. Emily was running orders to the kitchen, while Jake was trying to handle the register, but both of them were constantly looking over their shoulders, as if waiting for Sarah to appear and reprimand them for something. They moved quickly, trying to stay ahead of the chaos, but it was clear that they were working in a constant state of stress, never knowing when they would be punished for something they didn't even do. David could see the frustration building in their faces as they tried to keep the store running while Sarah remained hidden in her office. The lack of leadership was affecting the whole store. Without a clear presence from Sarah, the employees were left to pick up the slack, often taking on responsibilities that should have been handled by the manager. Emily, for example, was taking on the role of making sure the dining area was clean, ringing up orders and even helping out in the kitchen. Jake, too, was forced to juggle multiple tasks at once, trying to manage the cash register while keeping an eye on the floor. Their willingness to step up and keep things running was admirable, but it was clear that it wasn't sustainable. David could see how their energy was draining, how their smiles were becoming less frequent, and how the quality of service was slipping as the day went on. They were working harder, but their morale was dropping. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion. It was the emotional toll of knowing that their manager, the person who should have been supporting them, wasn't there when they needed her. David felt a growing sense of disappointment as he watched this cycle unfold. He had always believed that leadership was the cornerstone of a successful business, but here he was witnessing the direct result of poor leadership, a disorganized, stressed-out team with no one to turn to for support. As the hours passed, the cracks in the store's operations grew wider. The employees were doing their best, but the system they were working under wasn't designed to succeed. Sarah's approach of staying in her office, micromanaging from afar, was not only ineffective but damaging. It created an environment where the employees felt unsupported, where their efforts went unnoticed, and where their frustrations festered. David could see the toll it was taking on the workers, on Emily, Jake, and the others who were doing their best to keep the store afloat despite the lack of leadership from above. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the store was palpable. David observed as the staff rushed to keep up with the constant stream of orders, but the quality of service was slipping. Emily, who had been running back and forth between the kitchen and the counter, was visibly tired. She was sweating, her face flushed from the constant movement, but there was a palpable sense of frustration in her every step. Jake, too, was showing signs of burnout, his movements becoming slower as the hours wore on. And through it all, Sarah remained locked in her office, hardly ever emerging except to yell at someone or adjust the schedule. It was clear that her absence on the floor was leaving a huge gap in leadership. The employees, left to figure things out on their own, were increasingly frazzled, and the service was suffering because of it. David couldn't ignore the connection between Sarah's leadership, or lack thereof, and the decline in employee morale and customer service. Without strong leadership to guide them, the employees were left to struggle with no clear direction or support, and the customers, too, were feeling the effects. The longer David watched, the more he realized that the frustration from the employees was being passed on to the customers. Orders were taking longer, mistakes were being made, and the quality of service was declining. This wasn't just a minor issue. It was a breakdown at every level. David began to see how Sarah's behavior had set a negative tone for the entire store. Her failure to engage with her team, her micromanagement of the schedule without actually helping the employees, had created an environment of chaos and frustration, and it was clear that it wasn't just this store. This problem could very well be happening at other locations across Burgerhaven. The realization hit David like a ton of bricks. The store was in a state of disarray because Sarah's leadership was not only ineffective, it was harmful. The employees were being left to fend for themselves, and without proper guidance, their frustration was growing. David had always believed in the importance of leadership, but seeing it, or rather not seeing it, firsthand, was a sobering wake-up call. He knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen any longer. This wasn't just about one manager. It was about the entire company's approach to leadership. And if he wanted to turn things around, he would need to make some serious changes, starting with Sarah's approach to managing her team. It was time for a new direction, one that would prioritize support, communication, and respect for the employees who were the heart of the company. David wasn't going to let the business he had worked so hard to build fall apart because of poor leadership. He was determined to fix this. And he knew that the first step was addressing the root cause, Sarah and her failure to lead. David Thompson spent the night replaying everything he had observed during his undercover days at Burgerhaven. The disorganized chaos, the frustrated employees, and the pervasive sense of neglect from Sarah, the store manager, weighed heavily on him. The issues he had witnessed weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a much larger problem within the company. David had come to see just how deeply the leadership failure ran, and he couldn't stand by any longer. It was clear to him now that Sarah's lack of leadership had created a toxic work environment, and her indifference toward her employees was poisoning the culture at Burgerhaven. His gut told him it was time to act, immediately. There was no more time to wait for reports or further observations. This situation needed to be addressed right now, or else the very foundation of the company would continue to crumble. The next morning, David arrived at the store early, as he had done before, but this time there was a different energy in the air. He wasn't just there to observe anymore, he had a purpose. As soon as he walked into the store, he could feel the tension among the staff. There was a palpable sense of uncertainty, and as employees glanced up, they could see something was different about the way David was carrying himself. He wasn't disguised as John anymore. Today, he was the CEO of Burgerhaven, and he was here to make a statement. He had already made up his mind. Sarah's leadership was not just ineffective, it was actively harming the company. It was time for David to confront the management, face the issues head-on, and start making real, lasting changes. The employees had been suffering for too long, and he would no longer let their voices be ignored. David walked directly into the back office, where Sarah usually sat, her usual domain. He stood for a moment at the door, gathering his thoughts, and then knocked sharply, pushing the door open without waiting for a response. Sarah, startled by the unexpected entry, looked up from her desk, her face pale at the sight of David standing there. She looked flustered, unsure of what to say. Before she could open her mouth, David spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Sarah, I need to talk to you and the rest of the management team. Now." The shift in his tone was unmistakable. There was no room for hesitation, no time for small talk. Sarah's eyes widened as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She opened her mouth to protest, but David didn't give her the chance. "I'm David Thompson, CEO of Burger Haven, and I've spent the past few days undercover here in this store," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. The room fell silent, as the other managers, who had been seated around the table, stared at him in disbelief. They hadn't expected this. Sarah, too, was caught off guard, her face turning a deep shade of red as the realization of who was standing before her began to hit. The employees in the store were equally shocked. David had managed to blend in so well, his disguise fooling even the people who had worked with him for years. But now there was no hiding. He was the man at the top of the company, and he had seen everything. He had listened to the complaints of the employees, watched the lack of leadership, and observed the disregard for the workers' well-being. And now he was here to take action. He wasn't just going to stand by and let this toxic environment persist. David turned his attention to Sarah, his gaze unwavering. "I've seen enough to know that this store isn't being run the way it should be," he said, his voice steady. "The employees are overworked, undervalued, and left to fend for themselves because of poor management. I've heard their complaints, I've seen their frustration, and I'm not going to let this continue." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but David held up a hand to stop her. "Save it," he said, his tone sharp. "I've already heard enough from the employees. This is not just about one bad manager, it's about a system that's broken, and it starts with you." Sarah's face turned pale, and the other managers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. David's words stung, but he wasn't backing down. "I'm announcing an immediate investigation into your conduct, Sarah," David continued, his voice firm but not without empathy. "I don't take these matters lightly. The way you've managed this store, the way you've treated the employees, it's unacceptable. You'll be suspended while we look into this. In the meantime, changes will begin immediately." The weight of David's words hung heavily in the air. There was no room for debate, no turning back. This wasn't just a scolding. It was a wake-up call for the entire team. Sarah, who had always thought she was untouchable, now found herself facing the consequences of her actions. The other managers in the room sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to react to what they were hearing. David wasn't just speaking to Sarah. He was addressing the entire leadership structure of Burger Haven. David turned to the employees who were still in the store, standing by the counter and in the break room. "As for the rest of you," he said, his voice calm but resolute, "I want to apologize. You've been let down, and I've failed you as the leader of this company. But I'm here today to make sure that changes. I'm immediately implementing raises for employees who have been working hard under these conditions. I'm also making changes to the work schedules to ensure that no one is overburdened with excessive shifts. We will be looking into your concerns and addressing them one by one." David's words were met with a wave of mixed emotions. There was surprise, disbelief, and, for the first time in a long while, a glimmer of hope. The employees who had been working in fear, who had felt invisible and unappreciated, were finally hearing something they had longed to hear. Someone at the top actually cared. David knew that the road ahead would not be easy, and the changes would take time, but this was the first step toward rebuilding the trust he had lost with his team. As the meeting ended, David addressed the room one final time, making sure his voice carried the weight of his resolve. "We're going to rebuild this company from the ground up. It starts with respect for the people who make it all possible. You, the employees. From this day forward, no one here will be treated like they're just another cog in the machine. We're family, and that's how we'll run this company. I will be back to ensure that these changes are being implemented across the board, and I'll be checking in regularly to see that we're on the right track. The employees, though cautious, seemed to sense the sincerity in David's words. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope in the air. Change was coming, and they could feel it. David left the store that day knowing it was just the beginning, but he was ready to face the challenges ahead. This wasn't just about fixing one store. It was about transforming the entire culture of Burger Haven, and he was committed to seeing it through. The moment the meeting had ended, a heavy silence hung in the air. The employees of the Burger Haven store stood in shock, trying to process what David Thompson had just revealed. For years they had felt invisible, working under a system that had done little to acknowledge their hard work or their needs. But now, as the CEO of the company, David had taken responsibility for the mistakes that had been made. He had promised changes, and it was clear that he wasn't just speaking empty words. As he walked through the store, David could see the unease beginning to fade from the employees' faces. There was a tentative hope, but also a lingering doubt. Had they heard this kind of promise before? Would things really change this time? David knew that actions would speak louder than words. He didn't want to waste any time. He was going to implement the changes he had promised immediately. The first thing he did was look at Emily and Jake, two of the most hardworking and dedicated employees in the store. They had been the ones to step up when the leadership failed. Emily, in particular, had gone above and beyond, often taking on tasks that should have been handled by Sarah. David had watched her throughout his time undercover, and it was clear she had the heart, the drive, and the leadership skills needed to turn things around. David didn't waste a moment. He turned to Emily, who was still processing the changes, and made his decision. "Emily," he said, his voice steady, "I'm promoting you to permanent store manager. You've been doing the work of a leader already, and I believe you have the ability to guide this team to success." Emily's eyes widened in surprise, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "I didn't expect this, but I'll do my best." David's decision to promote Emily was just the beginning. He knew that recognition had to extend to the entire team, especially to those who had been overlooked for so long. Jake, who had been working tirelessly alongside Emily, was also due for recognition. His dedication to the job and his willingness to step up under difficult circumstances had not gone unnoticed. David turned to Jake, a warm smile on his face. "Jake, I'm giving you a raise as well. Your hard work and resilience have been invaluable to this store, and I want to make sure you're compensated for it." Jake's face broke into a surprised grin. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," he said, the sincerity in his voice evident. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was truly seen, like his efforts mattered. This was a small but important step in rebuilding the trust between the employees and management. With the promotions and pay raises in place, David knew the changes had to go beyond just recognition. The root of the problem lay in the way the store had been managed, and that needed to be addressed immediately. David wasn't just going to offer a raise and walk away, he was going to overhaul the entire system. He started by implementing new policies that would allow employees to voice their concerns and suggestions without fear of retaliation. One of the most important changes was the introduction of an anonymous employee feedback system. No longer would the employees be forced to bottle up their frustrations. They would have a direct line to management, where their concerns would be heard and addressed promptly, without fear of being dismissed or punished for speaking up. This system would allow employees to feel more empowered, knowing that their voices were being heard and taken seriously. David also recognized that the store's equipment had been neglected for far too long. Broken appliances, worn-out utensils, and outdated tools had been causing delays and frustration for the workers. It wasn't just about the inconvenience. It was about the message it sent to the employees, that they weren't worth the investment. David couldn't let that continue. He immediately introduced a policy of regular equipment checks to ensure that all tools and appliances were in good working order. Any issues would be addressed immediately, and the store would be properly maintained to ensure that employees had everything they needed to do their jobs effectively. This, too, was a sign that David was serious about making changes that would benefit the employees and improve their working conditions. But policies alone wouldn't fix the deep-seated issues that had been allowed to fester in the store. David knew that leadership was at the core of the problem, and for the changes to be truly effective, all managers needed to be held accountable. He introduced mandatory leadership training for all managers, focusing on communication, conflict resolution, and fostering a positive work environment. Sarah's failure to lead effectively had created a toxic atmosphere in the store, and David wasn't going to allow that to continue. Every manager, including Emily as the new store manager, would undergo this training to ensure they were equipped with the skills to lead with empathy, respect, and professionalism. David believed that strong, supportive leadership was the key to turning this store, and the company, around. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the store had already begun to shift. Employees who had once walked around with their heads down, weighed down by frustration and burnout, now moved with a renewed sense of purpose. There was a new energy in the air, one that was fueled by the changes David had made and the hope that things could truly get better. Emily, now the store manager, took charge with confidence, delegating tasks and offering words of encouragement to her team. Jake was more focused than ever, handling the register with ease and offering assistance to others. The employees were no longer working just to get by, they were working as part of a team, knowing that their efforts were valued and appreciated. For the first time in a long while, the store felt like a place where people could thrive, not just survive. David watched from the back of the store, his heart swelling with pride as he saw the positive changes taking root. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, he felt hopeful. These were the kinds of changes Burger Haven needed, real, tangible improvements that would benefit the employees and, in turn, improve the customer experience. He knew that the success of the company didn't just depend on the bottom line. It depended on the people who worked there, and now they were finally getting the support, respect, and recognition they deserved. The road to rebuilding Burger Haven had just begun, but David was more committed than ever to making sure that the company would be a place where employees could truly thrive. And that started with making sure they were treated like family. David Thompson walked into the Burger Haven store, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of optimism. The atmosphere inside was drastically different from the chaos he had witnessed during his undercover stint. The air felt lighter, as if the tension that had once hung thick in the store had finally begun to dissipate. Employees moved with a sense of purpose, not rushed or panicked, but confident in their role. The sight of Emily, the newly promoted store manager, walking through the dining area with a calm yet authoritative presence was enough to show David that the changes were already taking root. She moved with a quiet assurance, checking in with employees, offering encouragement, and keeping everything running smoothly. Jake was right there with her, no longer the timid worker he had once been. He handled the cash register with ease, and when customers asked for help, he responded with a professionalism that hadn't been there before. The transformation in the store was palpable, and David couldn't help but smile. This was the environment he had always envisioned for Burger Haven, one where the employees felt supported, valued, and empowered to lead. David knew this change wasn't just a one-off. It had to be part of a larger shift across the entire company. As he stood in the middle of the store, watching the employees work with renewed energy, he felt a surge of pride. The reforms he had put in place weren't just about fixing this one store. They were about reshaping the culture of Burger Haven from the ground up. He had seen firsthand how a lack of leadership and poor management could destroy morale. But now he was seeing the flip side. With strong leadership, open communication, and recognition for hard work, the employees were thriving. David was committed to making sure this success wasn't isolated to just this location. He was determined to ensure that every Burger Haven store would be a place where employees felt respected, heard, and appreciated. This wasn't just about improving one store. It was about setting a new standard for the company as a whole. To make sure these changes spread throughout Burger Haven, David immediately set up a meeting with his regional managers. The conversation was candid, focused on the lessons learned from the store's transformation. David made it clear that the changes seen here were just the beginning. "We are not going back to the way things were," he told them. "This is a new era for Burger Haven. Every single location needs to adopt these values: respect for employees, fair pay, leadership that leads by example. We need to create a culture where employees feel supported and motivated, not overworked and ignored." The regional managers listened attentively, knowing that David was serious. The days of relying solely on numbers and metrics to measure success were over. The focus now would be on employee satisfaction, open feedback, and leadership that inspired respect and trust. David made it clear that each store would undergo similar improvements: raise policies, leadership training, employee feedback systems, and better work-life balance. This was no longer just about running a fast food chain. It was about creating an environment where everyone, from the frontline workers to the management, could grow, thrive, and contribute to the company's success. As the weeks went by, David kept his promise to stay connected with his employees. He didn't just make changes and walk away. He was actively involved, ensuring that the improvements were being implemented consistently across the board. He began visiting different Burger Haven locations in person, spending time with employees, talking to them about their experiences, and making sure their concerns were being addressed. Each visit was an opportunity to listen, to learn, and to reinforce the values that had led to the transformation in the first place. No longer operating from the top down, David sought to create a more horizontal, collaborative approach to leadership, one where employees were empowered to speak up, offer feedback, and take ownership of their work. He was determined to make sure that the changes he had started were sustainable, that the company would no longer slip back into the bad habits that had plagued it before. His commitment to staying connected to his employees, to listening to their concerns, and to maintaining an open dialogue became the foundation for the new Burger Haven. Meanwhile, Emily continued to shine in her new role. She had embraced the responsibilities of store manager with a passion, and under her leadership the store was thriving. She led by example, working alongside her team, offering support and recognizing the efforts of those around her. Employees who had once been disillusioned with their work now felt proud to be part of the team. The atmosphere in the store was no longer tense or hostile. It was positive, collaborative, and supportive. Employees were speaking up, offering suggestions for improvements, and feeling more motivated than ever. David knew that Emily's success wasn't just about her, it was about the way the entire store had been transformed. Her leadership was a direct result of the changes he had made, and it was a shining example of what was possible when the right environment was created for people to flourish. The success of this store didn't go unnoticed. As Burger Haven began implementing the same policies and changes at other locations, David could see the ripple effect taking place. Employees at other stores were beginning to feel the benefits of the new approach: better working conditions, more recognition, and a clearer path to leadership. The once toxic atmosphere was being replaced with a sense of pride and ownership. Employee satisfaction scores started to rise, and turnover rates began to fall. The customers, too, began to notice the difference. Service was quicker, friendlier, and more efficient. The change in the company was tangible, and it was making a difference not only in the lives of the employees, but also in the success of the business. David was seeing the results of his hard work, and while there was still much to be done, he knew that Burger Haven was on the right path. For David, the most rewarding part of the transformation wasn't just the improved metrics or the better bottom line. It was seeing the employees, the heart of the company, finally getting the respect and recognition they deserved. No longer were they just faceless workers behind the counter or in the kitchen. They were valued members of a team that was working together to build something great. As he stood back and watched his employees work with pride, knowing that they were being treated with dignity and respect, David knew that this was just the beginning. The new Burger Haven was more than a business. It was a community, and it was a community worth being a part of. The road ahead was filled with opportunities, and David was committed to ensuring that every employee, every leader, and every customer would feel the positive change that was sweeping through the company. Burger Haven was no longer just a place to work. It was a place to thrive. Thank you for watching Deep Inside HQ. If you found these stories eye-opening, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest behind-the-scenes revelations. We dive deep into the truth of corporate life, exposing what really goes on behind closed doors. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of today's story? And if you want to see more of these real-life transformations, like and share this video with your friends. Join us as we uncover the untold stories that drive change. We'll see you in the next episode.